Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar this month on getting your board to say yes to project spend. We've got various people joining over the next minute or two, so we'll just give them a little bit more time. We'll start, as I say, in about a couple of minutes' time, so please bear with us. Okay, so let's begin. So today we've got for those of you that know our sessions well, we've got a slightly different angle that we're going to take. And the reason for that is we're lucky enough to have two independent non-profit consultants in today who've got a lot of experience of getting IT spend approved, getting IT projects implemented in membership associations, charities, trades unions, and so on, which are exactly the markets that we at Smart Impact play in. So firstly, we have Alan Reed, who a number of you may know from previous sessions we've run. And Alan will be doing some of the early presentations and questions. And we've also got Charles Veal, who comes from a long experience of very similar things as I described. And essentially, we'll be having small presentations, but mostly a discussion around what we see working well, what we see working not so well, and so on. So by way of introduction, we're recording the session, so we'll get this sent out to you within the next couple of days. We have to do some finessing of it. The whole point of this is questions and answers, so please use the chat box. Chat's enabled for everyone, so put questions in there. We've already got some questions that have been raised already, but as we go along, please put the questions in there. We'll be monitoring them and we're doing our best to answer them throughout the session. And those that we don't get to, we'll answer by email afterwards, or if you want to talk to us, you can do that as well. So what we're going to do, firstly, from Alan, he's going to be talking around some of the core issues and challenges about getting projects approved. Then we've got and we'll have some Q&A around that. Then we've got a short section on basically 5 things that you should try and do, questions and answers about what works there and so on. And then we'll open it up wider to the audience, as we said. So please put questions in the posts. And with that, over to Alan.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Good morning, everybody. My name's Alan Reed. I'm an independent consultant in the membership and charity space. Like Steve, I'm really delighted to welcome Charles Veal on as well. Very similar background to my own. And we've both spent, Charles and I, we've both spent something like 20 years helping organizations answer the question, what's the best use of our money when it comes to tech spend? Should we invest in what we've got to improve it? Should we recognize that the best use of our money is actually to go out and replace it? And then how do we make that case to the management team? How do we make sure that they are understanding how this fits into our business, and then seeing that this is a well thought out process that they can then approve the spend and then go ahead with a big change to the business. So it takes some finessing, it takes some doing. So we like to give you some tips on that as we go. So first of all, starting off with the real basics of what are the reasons for project spend, and then how should that color the way that you're asking for the money. So if we look at some very basic reasons for project spend, first of all, the one that most people think of all of the time is big system replacements. We need to replace the website because no one can find anything, or the user journeys are awful, or we need to replace the CRM because everyone's disempowered and wasting a lot of staff time doing things manually, that kind of thing. Continuous improvements is something that's really become more talked about since around 2015 or so. People are recognizing that they don't want to be doing 2 years of disruption and some huge project every 10 years. Why don't we continue improving what we've got, investing in what we've got, recognize that our business is changing, therefore we need to keep spending on the current system in order to keep it lively and fresh and keep us competitive. Then we have ad hoc improvements. So these come up all of the time and surprisingly often don't get funded. So it might be a change to the regulatory environment. Well, that might have a good chance of getting funded, but also changes in member expectations. You might have a new membership offering. You might be, trying a new fundraising approach. And those kind of things will need support for the systems, or the systems become very separate from your business. And again, people start working around and doing things manually. And then another area for advice and consulting is really where, for funding approvals, is where you're looking for advice. It's often not clear from the preceding 3 areas where you would best spend your money. What's the best use of the money? So should I invest or replace? And how do I get clarity on that? So essentially, what we find is a little bit of advice in that at that point can save an awful lot of trouble. So, but then that's very, very difficult to get funded. People don't often value paying for advice. So Charles, do you mind if I draw you in at this point? So first of all, do you mind if I just ask you to introduce yourself slightly? Is that okay?
That's fine. Hello, everybody. My name's Charles Veal, and like Alan, I've been working in membership for about 20 years. And the last 6 or so years working really on digital transformation projects. And prior to that, I worked kind of the client side, so often in your positions as a director of membership or a head of membership.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles. So in your experience, looking at the list of typical spending requests, do you find that some of them are harder to get spending approval for, are harder to justify? Some of them that might need more of a kind of nuanced business case?
I think with all of the spending approvals, it's been really clear what you're trying to achieve really helps with that business decision. In the end, the big system replacement or the large capital spends are always the hardest to try and justify and the hardest to get that kind of approval. And real clarity about what you're doing and why really helps to get things across the line. And this is where advice or consulting or some sort of support can be very useful. Sometimes, particularly for the very large expenditures, it's not necessarily always appropriate for an organization right at that point in time where they can help keep some of their systems going for a year or 2. But it will help give clarity as to how much they're going to have to spend within a couple of years and how they're going to approach funding this. So for me, it's always tricky getting that big spend signed off, but real clarity about how it fits in with your wider organizational aspirations, your strategic direction, and understanding where the cash is and how much the organization can afford is so important.
That makes an awful lot of sense. And I like the point about tying it in to your organizational goals. Essentially, if you want us to achieve these things, then we need the tools to do the job. In a way, you're kind of putting it back on the fund holders to say, look, there has to be consistency here. If you're looking for us to do modern member engagement and increase our membership numbers or increase our retention, then we can't do that if we don't do the tools. So I like that
Alan,
point.
Can I just give a very concrete example? So a board had set a strategy for doubling the membership with an organisation we were working with. The system was clunky, they could have survived with it. But frankly, if they doubled the number of members, they'd have to double the number of staff to process these membership applications. At that point, it became more obvious that in order to meet the strategic goal, they're going to have to invest in that big system replacement. And so the context really mattered for justifying a quite considerable business spend.
I like that point too. So it's essentially saying, look, here are the problems. Every time someone does this thing on the website, there's some kind of manual tasks that we have to do. So we can either get more people, like a battery hen shed of people doing manual transactions, or we can stop pretending it's an automated process and actually make it an automated process. Steve, do you mind if I just bring you in on the topic of continuous improvements? Obviously, you provide dynamic solutions. And the idea is that when people are buying this thing that, Microsoft is spending billions on, they hope it's going to be their forever home. They hope that, all right, well, I've moved from my older thing to this new thing. Millions of people are using it. And so I shouldn't have to change again. But there's been this kind of realization. So what is the kind of messaging from a modern membership supplier around continuous improvements, please?
Well, it's never really changed. I just think some organizations have recognized the need for it and started to practice. So what we found for many, many years is that any purchase was budgeted on a buy it, keep it for 5 years, what's it going to cost to provide a break-fix support service, and then assume that it's going to come to end of life and then go through that whole cycle again, which is big spend, big staff upheaval while you change your technology, and so on and so on and so on. What we've been advising and what a lot of our most successful customers do now is have this idea of continuous improvement. So you don't just have a break-fix support service by phone or email, but you have a budget set aside every year from go live to enhance the project, enhance the system, because as Charles was alluding to before, the system should be there to support your business strategy. And if your strategy is, in that example, to double your size, you want to become more and more efficient with more and more automation, so you can double the size without doubling the cost of supporting that membership. But other organizations may want to enhance training, may want to enhance support, and so on. So by having a continuous improvement budget there, you can do a few days a month or a chunk of days a quarter. So the system's constantly keeping up to date with you. And a lot of organizations are starting to realize this now. The benefit of that is when you get to the 5 years, you avoid the big re-implementation cost of hundreds of thousands of pounds, and you completely avoid the staff upheaval because they're trying to change from one system to another. You don't need to do that because your current system is still up to date and it's still driving your business strategy and supporting where you want to be. So you haven't got a reason to change it, because if you're on the right platform, and we would argue Dynamics is the right platform, it's technologically advanced, it's accepting a lot more of the more modern ideas like AI, and so on and so on. So that's a rather longer answer than maybe you were expecting.
It makes sense. Yes, no, thank you. So no, that makes sense. And the reality as well, of course, and we do come back to this, is that member expectations or external stakeholders, fundraising people and beneficiaries, etc., they all have increased expectations now over what they would have expected a few years ago. And if you're not keeping up with that, those expectations for modern digital engagement, then of course they'll stop engaging. They'll move on. Very good, thank you. So then moving on to another point, the question that often gets raised all the time is, why is it so hard to get project spending approved? And I think one of the main things here is to understand what the challenges are. If you're being asked to make a funding decision, it's always a lot of money for the organization. So Steve, you mentioned hundreds of thousands a second ago. For some organizations, that's actually an awful lot bigger than they would spend. For some organizations, it could be in the millions. It's always a lot of money to the trustees, finance committee, etc. So seek to understand why they would be hesitant, and then you can address those hesitancies as part of your business case. So, for instance, a couple of reasons that we see all the time is going to be the reality for most organizations is there are lots of competing needs for the same money. At the same time, you're saying, oh, we need better digital engagement, or this part of the website is awful, or our comms are too generic. We just send the same stuff to everyone that everyone ignores. Someone else is saying, oh, our education program is really lacking right now, or we need a new staff member for this, or we need to replace our hosting. So it's understanding those competing needs and making sure that your needs reflect the needs of the business, as Charles was saying earlier, so that your request comes to the top. There's a second point on there, which is that it's always easier not to make a decision. Having put pitches for funding in front of boards of trustees for many years. There's a natural human thing that many boards of trustees will do, which is to avoid making the decision. They'll essentially say, "Oh, can we have some more research on this? Can we, get some more information on that? Why is this so expensive? I'm a trustee for another organisation that's nothing like you, and they've done something that's a fraction of this cost." So there are all of these reasons that people can find to put off a decision. And when you understand that, it's really helpful, I find, to envisage your funding person as quite grumpy and preferring not to make the decision. It then helps when you structure your business case to kind of box them in a little bit. So you're expressing the urgency of what needs doing. You're putting a time frame to things to avoid that. Then, of course, it's often the case that, and when we're when you're talking about how to make a funding approach internally and then maybe to non-execs, the non-execs, often the brightest people in the world, really understand the sector and their business, but there's no reason they should understand technology projects. And sometimes they'll think of it as a kind of glorified spreadsheet and they have no idea that it's genuinely strategic, it's genuinely enabling or disabling to what you're trying to achieve as a business. Sometimes as well, where people have used very old systems. If you're on a system that's kind of 15, 20 years old, then there's no culture of approving spend. They haven't done what Steve was talking about, continuous improvement. They haven't done a big replacement in the last 5 years where they're used to the kind of costs that exist now. So there's no culture of it. So their thinking of costs is 20 years out of date, and now you're having to update that in one go. One of the most common problems that happens with that, by the way, is that organizations can't justify the proper costs, will spend less and then waste it. So there are some important messaging around that. But one of the most common reasons that people don't get approval, so we've been kind of dumping on non-execs and finance committee members for not getting it, but actually the most common reason that I find, and I'm interested in Charles's view on this, is that the project spend doesn't get approved because people don't know how to make the case properly. They don't know how to say, we need a lot of money spent on this, but here's why it'll benefit the organization. Here's the reason for spending this and why it's a good use of the organization's precious money. So that is the most common one, that people put together not terribly articulate costs cases, and then it doesn't get accepted. They don't socialize it properly, and it doesn't get accepted. So Charles, could I just ask for your view on that? Let's take the last one first. How often do you find that people don't know how to run a bid for spending through their own organization? You know, they're very focused on just getting the document right, but then don't look more widely.
It is a sort of common problem. I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever heard about a board was, if a board is making a decision in their meeting, you haven't done the preparation. And essentially, the board should be signing off what they're already aware is coming. And there are a number of ways that you can do this. So 2 projects I've worked on recently, they had a technically minded board member who'd been involved in the original design of the business case and for the funding bid and the reasoning. So that by the time it got to the board, the rest of the board members, A, were aware of the decision that was coming, but B, there was a trusted member of the board themselves who was behind and committed to this project. And so that goes back to Alan's point about the importance of socialization first of all, so that it's really clear. The second thing is understanding what makes boards tick. And it was really interesting, Alan's choice of words. You know, often funding bids are articulated in how things will benefit. And whilst I think that's very important, often I see it in terms of the successful bids are risk mitigation. If you have a 15 to 20-year-old system, it's probably not got the latest security protections, or it's likely to be an old service and might fall over. So for the last 3 projects I've been involved on, the driving factor was risk. Either their database will become uninsurable, or that they are holding very sensitive information, essentially on very old servers, which were no longer supported. And helping the board understand the risk was one of the cornerstones for making them invest in the future. It wasn't just about what you could achieve, but it's also what's the issue if you don't act. And I think it's been really clear with boards, making sure that you socialize them well, so they're not making a decision in the board meeting. They should have discussed everything beforehand in warm-up meetings with the board, or they've got key stakeholders who are engaged. Secondly, whilst it's great to talk about the benefits, don't miss out on the risk. Not investing is often a significant problem, and boards on the whole tend to be extremely risk averse. So it's quite a useful way of getting approval.
I think that's a really good point. So, and we talk about this a little later, but there's a whole kind of don't forget to focus on the negative. And of course, we all want to be positive in our lives and in all of our messaging. But exactly as Charles says, if you can link your project to the operational safety of your business, then of course that negative business case, as I call it, is extremely powerful. Now, you usually have to sweeten the pill as well. So, saying, if we spend this, then we're less likely to implode. But you can also, typically with the same project, there are benefits too. So yes, you're mitigating the risk. Vital to mention that, or to be really very clear about that, and say, look, whilst nobody likes not having a choice, we really don't have a choice on this. But actually, it's not all bad. Here are really significant benefits we'll get from this spend as well. But I completely agree.
Alan, can I make just one last point? I don't know how
Please.
boards manage to achieve this, but they always seem to have somebody from the awkward squad who will ask an incredibly obscure question. And it doesn't really matter what the obscure question is. It's about giving the sense that you really understand your business case. And they often deliberately ask the questions, not because they're really interested in what the answer is, but are you confident and are you clear on the detail? So going into that board meeting, being prepared for a range of questions and able to give a confident response is really important, because even if the question isn't terribly important or germane, if you show a lack of confidence in that meeting about a question, it starts to undermine the board's confidence in the whole project. So know your detail and expect something awkward.
Absolutely, that's a really important point, and of course this goes back to a couple of things that we've talked about. One is, if you're socializing, then that means that there's a chance to have you're showing it to your colleagues, your fellow directors or the management team before it's getting approved, seeking approval, and maybe actually meeting with that awkward squad member first, in the months running up to asking for the formal yes no, to say, does this give you what you need? Is there any questions you might have about this? And of course, as soon as someone's had some input into the business case, they're typically on board. They're typically on side with it. But yes, preparation and understanding your audience and your subject matter are absolutely vital. All right, let's move on. The next point really is about the contents of the business case and why it really matters. Now, I don't want to just we've got this slide and the next one where we're talking about what you should put in. I don't want to just list a sequence of the contents page of your business case, because actually you can Google that. What I want to have is the human side of what really matters when you're putting your business case together in terms of getting it approved and understood and supported. So the first thing, a point that I make all the time, which is the business case isn't just a document saying, oh, can I have this number of tens of thousands of pounds to do this thing. It's important that you recognize that it is the foundation of your project. And if you're running a project properly, by the way, you should be referring back to the business case from time to time, because that's what you said you were going to do. That's the promises that you made as part of this project. So it's the foundation where you're saying, this is what we're going to achieve for this amount of money, for these benefits, to mitigate these risks, etc. And it's going to take about this long. So it's not just a funding request. It is actually starting to define your project in as much detail as you have at that point. Other detail will become available later. And you're starting to establish how it's going to be run and what it is going to be done. It's part of the project, not some pre-thing before the project. It is part of the project. The other thing is to recognize that your business case, or whatever case structured bid for funding you're putting forward, it has to enable informed decision making. So you have to imagine that these people know nothing when you start. They're not going to be technically minded. They're not going to, appreciate what modern digital engagement does or is. So it has to inform decision making by providing that context, providing the rationale, the costs, benefits, and risks, but really explaining the background and going back to Charles. Why are you doing this, and why it's the best use of your money. But the key thing that I find people forget over and over when you're asking for money to do something is to recognize that your business case or your request for this money is essentially a promise. You're saying, if you give me this, if you allow us to spend this, we will deliver that. And the benefits can be risk mitigation, but also, yes, these other things that will enable the business to be better off. So once you recognize that this is, if you give me A, I will deliver B, you then have to, you understand you have to couch the business case language in those terms. You have to show how it will be measured. You have to show, that this is realistic to get these benefits out of it. Because boards of trustees or finance committee members might say, I can definitely see the outbound money. That's easy. I can see the invoices that you're forecasting, but I can't see, why we'll get anything back. So you have to be very clear about the deal and the promise that you're making, and that's clear and credible. And then a question that I get asked a lot as well is, do you always need a business case? And then, so the short answer is there always needs to be some kind of structured request. There always needs to be something that isn't just, oh, well, let's do this thing and then expect it to get approved. It should be scaled up or down. So if you're asking for something that's a vast amount of money for your organization, whatever it is, then it's worth spending, days, weeks, or months preparing for getting that understood, agreed, and approved. If it's something more every day, then of course you can scale it down to that. But it's always better to overdo it than to underdo it. Is what I find. So Charles, do you mind if I bring you back in there to just a kind of open question, if you don't mind? When it comes to your experience of getting these things approved or approaching the approval process, what are the kind of most common mistakes that you see people making during the cycle of approvals?
I think one of the biggest mistakes is clarity. And so often people go for detail. So in order to convince a board or to convince a sort of senior directors, there's often a feeling that a business case must be thorough. And whilst that's true, that third bullet point on the left-hand side really sums it up. Explaining the story. I want you to spend £1 million, £100,000, £10,000, whatever it happens to be. And in exchange, this is going to be the benefits. You'll have a great new system, you can double your membership, and you mitigate this risk. Having that story really clear upfront in people's minds really helps with them making a decision. And often where you get very detailed documents where the story is almost at the back, people find it very difficult to work through the detail. You still need the detail, and this might be in the form of appendices or something that you detail in later on. But that kind of executive summary, in the end, I want this in order to do that, and here's the story. Nice and clear, really makes it so much easier for everybody to understand what's going on.
I think that's really important. And in fact, I find a good business case opens up with that line. We are seeking approval for a spend of blah in order to achieve A, B, and C. And even the most short attention span funding approver should have no excuse for being able to say that, to make a decision about that. The other mistake I find people make, Charles, I'd be interested in your view. Sometimes people make it too obvious that this is the only way. They obviously have a bee in their bonnet. They want to do a thing, and it might be the correct thing. It might be the absolute. But if you haven't shown your homework of why this is the best use of money, and that showing that you've considered the other options over and above spending the money. So, for instance, if you're saying we need to replace this system, have you thought, you have to show that you've considered making the current system last another year or two. I find that people get very, in the business case, it can be very blinkered, and then that can cause it to be rejected. Do you find that as well? Do you find that in your own experience?
It is, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. A business case feels far more credible when alternative options are explored. And there is also an art in business case writing where typically you'll say, well, here's the problem, here's what we want to achieve, here are 3 options, and your preferred option is, option B or whatever. But by giving it context, you could stay, you could spend loads, you could spend a moderate sum of money. It helps show the board that you've considered the various options. There's also a human psychology element that your story will probably be guiding towards your preferred option. And by making the other options less appealing, it makes it more easy for your particular option to be selected. So context matters, but it's also that you can shape the psychology of which option people are likely to choose.
Exactly, and with your other options, they can't just be there just so that you can rule them out. Here's option B. It's impossible. That can undermine your case as well. Thank you. All right, so let's move to some specific elements that get included. As I say, you can Google contents of a business case and you'll get this stuff. But I want to pick out some particular points to cover in here. Steve, I'm going to ask you in a minute really how people could consider the success criteria of a modern, let's say, CRM and digital engagement project. I'll come back to you on that in a second. But on here, what we find is, what I find is really important with a business case is that you're explaining how the money will be spent if it's approved. So it's not just saying, give me this, and then, I'll come back to you later with what we'll do with the money, because that undermines confidence that you've thought it all through. So having these elements within the business case shows that you've thought it through, that if they hand you this bag of cash, that you've already considered what the best use of it is, and the spread of costs and all of those things. So what I find is that, yes, this might seem like a lot, but some of this can be a paragraph or two. Some of it is more structured and formal. So Charles, could I ask you, what do you find to be the key elements that really have to be highlighted from the typical range of contents in the business case document?
I think going back to what we've already kind of mentioned, really being super clear, what's the purpose of this project and why. The other thing, boards in the end, it's costs and risks. So looking at the sort of list here, really being very clear on the costs and the return on investment, and there are some very useful ways of thinking about return on investment, will really help them understand the benefits and what they should anticipate in terms of their spend. So clarity and costs are often that kind of really core things to boards. But as Alan said earlier, you don't just want to focus on the negative, also the benefits, describing how the future can be better. Though that the benefits of the whole project is very, very important.
Great, thank you. And then Steve, if you don't mind, just how people can measure success in a modern world of digital engagement. It's not all, you can't always say, we're going to make 10% more on our membership revenue. And it would be very hard to prove that if you did claim that. But of course, digital engagement is quite a nuanced area of people being able to engage with you in a more sophisticated way, two-way engagement, etc. How have you found in a modern environment it's helpful to start defining what success looks like on this kind of project? On a typical modern digital project?
Well, I think there's probably 2 or 3 different elements. I mean, the first is, and we've touched on it, and we'll come back to it as well, is organizations don't go and buy computer systems because they love using computer systems. They buy them to support their business strategy. So some of your measures of success should be elements that are measurable of that strategy, which could be doubling the size of your members, increasing training revenue by 15%, moving into new areas, and so on and so on. So those should be measurable targets, and they should be baselined at the beginning of any project anyway, so you can measure the success. But then after all, because it is a computer project, you've got two groups of users here. You've got the users within your organization. So you can measure things like adoption, how often they're using it, has it made any difference to productivity or time taken to do things, or improved manual processes, which means people have got more time to spend on member services. And the other side of it is member engagement, which is, I think, where you were focusing your question. So we have tools that enable you to specify a whole range of different member touch points. So do they go on this website? Do they go on this page? Do they then go to that other page? Does that equal more points than just going to the first page only? And so on. So how do they react to events? Do they click on your emails? Do they come to events if they book on them? And so on and so on. So we've got a whole range of different measurable elements that each organization can define and then measure. And then you've got a good idea of whether your trends are going up or down in your whole membership base, but crucially as well, whether individual membership is changing, because they might then be looking to lose interest and not renew, and so on and so on. So there's a whole range of different elements that should be tracked, and they're covering user adoption, member engagement, but also your core business benefits that you're trying to improve upon as well.
Excellent. That makes an awful lot of sense. And just a reminder to people, we've had some really good pre-event Q&A questions come in that I'm going to be putting to Charles and Steve. But if you've got questions about your own project, and the management team are ignoring you or something, please drop it into the chat, and then we'll include it in the Q&A at the end. Okay, so great. What I'll do from here, Steve, if you don't mind, is I'll just hand over so that we can start talking about some practical advice on how people should approach this, and what you can do, in a very hands-on way to make sure you get the outcome you're looking for.
Fine. So so I'm back on that. Okay, so we'll look at 5 main areas of where you might want to put some focus in the correct preparation of your business case. So the first is the people side, and we've touched on elements of this, but obviously you need buy-in from the board to get the board decision in your way, but there's a lot of build-up you can do on the way to that. So it's really socializing this around colleagues, around who you believe your colleagues are, influencers onto the board, but also onto the board. And Charles alluded to a good point earlier, where your board might be made up of people that are very used, they might be from large industry and used to signing off millions of pounds worth of stuff. And if you're going to go and ask them for £50,000, they might just see that as a rounding error and just wave it through, or they might see it as, well, it's quite trivial anyway. So do we get anything in benefit for that? So it's a matter of understanding your board or your approval makeup as well, and then working out how you can influence them, but how any of your colleagues can influence as well. So I always think back to a good example of an organization where there was a very noisy senior manager who was a funny guy, but would always have an opinion on anything. And one of his opinions was he didn't want a new computer system. And so the guys that were driving this project forward put a lot of time into him to make sure it would benefit him in terms of business and personal, and he became a champion. And once he'd become a champion, then everyone noticed that and started to think, well, this should be a project that we start to invest in, and it got signed off. So that's really the angle of this. So I suppose a question for Charles, really, have you got any good examples of how socializing really has helped projects move forwards and influence the board to make the decision that people wanted?
So working with one particular organization, and they delayed investing in a computer system for a long time, and there was always a lot of essentially dissension on the board about whether it made sense or not. So actually, in the preparation for the business case, one of the board members, we managed to get co-opted. So they were no longer just at the board, they were actually coming in for a few of the business case meetings themselves. We discussed their concerns, issues, challenges that they had, and they helped shape that business case. So that when we actually went to the board itself, the board would basically all turn their heads to this one person and said, we've effectively delegated for you to understand the detail. Are you happy with what's going on? And since they've been involved, they were willing to say, yes, it's the right choice. I've seen the suppliers. I understand why they're making these investments and these choices. And so that was quite on the far end of the engagement that you see, where you actually get somebody from the board to be actively involved. But it transformed it, and it stopped them delaying the decision and waiting for the next year, because essentially they got somebody that they trusted on board.
And that's a great example, in fact, because you're getting people right on the inside from the start. So
yes,
and Alan, obviously budgets go in cycles, computer wholesale replacements go in longer cycles, but how long do you think organizations need on this socializing side to get everyone aligned in the right way, and over what sort of time period do you think is applicable?
It's a really good question, because I think one of the things you should be aware of if you are asking your organization to make a big decision is, what is their funding cycle? What is their budget approval cycle? So it might be a quarterly meeting, and then all right, well, I'll brace them in the next quarterly meeting. If I can work towards kind of sharing what we're planning on doing and some kind of rough element of costs, so that, well, I'm not asking for approval yet, but I'm just warning them and getting any initial concerns, and then I'll make the actual approval on the one after that. So it's good to have a little sketch of where you're going to fit into the funding approval process. Then the other part of the question is, how long does it take of your time to create the case and get it approved? One of the things I find to be extremely helpful is, before you're going anywhere near asking for the funding approval, arrange things like, as you're starting to put together, this is what I'm planning to do, I'm seeking this amount of money to do these things, to solve these problems and deliver these benefits. Start having little mini meetings with the people who are stakeholders in this. This might be the wider management team, it might be individuals, and saying, so this is what we're planning to. Do you agree? Is there anything you think I've forgotten here? Is there something that any questions or something we need to add? And doing those mini meetings as you're building your document, and then you take their feedback, build it into the document, and then meet them again in a week or two's time. It sounds time consuming, but these can be very short meetings. But actually, it's what makes the critical difference, I find, between getting something agreed and approved and getting it right, and not on all of those things. If you can essentially go to the fund holders and say, we're in agreement, the management team are in agreement, we're in a bit of a lobby, therefore we're coming to you together effectively, you're much more likely to get the go ahead, and also much less likely to find any huge gaps in what you're asking for.
Fine. Well, thanks. That's really helpful. I mean, I think my key takeaway on this is, to get this moving, someone is going to have a lot of passion and belief that this is the right thing to do. But that's not enough. If you're the only passionate guy, you're going to have to get support around you. And that's exactly what this is about. So next slide. You've got systems. They may be working very well. They may be working okay. They may not be working very well at all. But you do have incumbent experts on what your opportunities are and what you can do better. And those are the current suppliers. So, this is presupposing that you're not in a state of war with your supplier and you still have a good relationship. But remember, a lot of what we're talking about today isn't wholesale replacement of what you've got. It can be piecemeal improvement, continuous improvement, and so on. So your current supplier can be, the best source of information about what you could be doing. And our customers quite often ask us as well. They say, look, what should we be thinking about in the next 2 or 3 years? They don't come to us with, we want to do this and this and this and this all the time. Some do. But they say, look, what can we do better? Do we need to spend more money in this way? What sort of budgets do you think we should have for continuous improvement? And what areas of the system should be replaced and enhanced and so on. So that's very helpful, because that's a really collaborative way, and it's in the current supplier's best interest to give a viable path that keeps their system up to date with what you want to do, because then you won't be replacing it in that 5-year cycle that became quite common. So I think this is a very important area to look to, but also it's a fair point to say as well that if you're considering replacing your supplier, then a lot of people are very scared about this, because they think it's like an imminent divorce and will have all of the pain around that. Quite often it's not. Quite often you can do this in a very subtle way that improves your supplier, or at least they know that there's a finite date, and people will work proactively towards that and part as good levers. So I wouldn't be scared about it, but make sure that you've got your ground covered first, because we have heard some suppliers where that they will essentially start to make it a lot more difficult for you. So you need to judge your supplier relationship, but it's usually quite a good thing to be open about this. So I suppose question for Charles. If we think about wholesale replacement, that's a very clear view. But how would you advise people going around, if they're in a project, how do they go around getting a 2 or 3 or 4 year continuous improvement budget to just continually take this project forwards? Because that's often a lot harder to do than getting the initial spend. So how would you go around that? Because it's much more subtle, isn't it?
It is much more subtle. And I think the point was made earlier that systems are constantly evolving. And so actually you need to have spend for continuous improvement. But for me, I think one of the most important messages, when you get initial capital spend, people often think that once you finish spending, you'll have this beautiful new system and that's it. They can just go away and forget about it. Most of the systems that you will spend on will be the minimum viable. It's enough to make it work. They're usually pretty good, but it is a starting point. And I think socializing right at the beginning of any big capital spend that a new system is a starting point. After that, you can develop it. And even if you end up with the world's greatest system, a year after using it, you'll have a bright spark moment to go, now I understand how we really ought to be using it. So this idea of continuous improvement, I think, should be built into any kind of project. And typically we see the more ambitious organizations might be talking about 25% of capital spend. So if you've got a £100,000 project, you might all be thinking, well, I need at least 25,000 each and every year afterwards to continually develop. And it's such an important part in the modern world, but helping your key stakeholders understand that the moment the CRM or the website is in, the journey's really beginning. It doesn't end with that new project, and that this is normal, this is important. Technology evolves, what you want to do evolves and change. And so to avoid having, as Steve said, replacing it every 5 years, you need that continuous improvement funding.
Thanks, Charles, because that brings us on quite neatly to the next point, which is once your system MVP is in place, how do you continually get budget to improve that? So this is about taking it to the next stages and growing the systems to support your business strategy and so on. So for instance, I've seen a number of organizations where they'll have the original MVP spend, the system goes live, but then the business case for that original MVP is then produced some growth in training revenue or some growth in member size and therefore member revenue. And that helps fund continual improvements as well. So you can try to tie the two things together in that way, as well as just going to a clear improvement from taking us here to the next thing. You're using money that you've already earned back already. So that can work quite well. But I suppose the question around this for Alan, how would you best try to work out the more tangible or intangible benefits? So revenue growth, training growth, that's simple. Time spent, money saved, that's good. But what about the less tangible areas, and how do you put a sort of value around those?
I think it's. I think there's a couple of specific things I tend to do. So one is in terms of connecting your organizational goals more widely. There's a really specific trick or technique that I think all of us should do, which is go and find what your organizational goals are. They're often published on your website. It's your 5-year plan, your project 2025, whatever it might be. And there'll be specific things that are set there as aspirations. So what it's really helpful to do is to say, here is the aspirations that we've published to the world and you've demanded the management team deliver for you. And then add a column to the right and just say, here's how the project will assist with that. And here's how the project will hinder us. Not doing the project will hinder us if we don't do it. That tends to kind of, here's your words. Words are cheap. Here's what we need to do in order to deliver on that stuff. And a lot of those goals can be a bit woolly, but improve our outreach, improve our perception by our members, make sure that members have the career support that they need. Those are kind of intangibles to a degree. Of course, you can survey for responses, but what you're able to do with those intangibles is to say, if we do A, B, and C, our engagement will be more personalized, more targeted, more relevant, and we will get better take up. We can say that confidently. So by putting it in that way, here's what the project will enable us to do, and we will get these benefits from it, even though they're not strictly number driven. Then that could be very persuasive. Making those clear, assertive comments of benefits and how you'll measure them, I think is what can then attach the money you're asking for to the organizational benefits that are going to be promised as a result.
Very good. So it's not only setting a vision for this rosy future of all the new things you'll be able to do and all the new objectives you'll be able to reach, but also I think the final point on this slide is the negative side as well. So if your current setup just prevents you from achieving some of the core goals that your organization wants, then say so, but don't say that as a litany of bad news and things that can't happen and I'm spending so much time doing this and so on and so on. It should be around the fact that, for instance, a classic example is if you've got a team of people that's just spending all of their time moving data from one place to another because the systems aren't integrated, then how much time is that? What can you achieve with that time by redirecting them if you automated it and the linkage was happening? What else can they do with that time, and what benefits can that bring that are more tangible or intangible benefits to the members? And how can that improve members' frustration levels or lowering members' frustration levels? So again, the question around this is, where can you turn negatives into positives and then start to give return on investment conversations around that? So, Charles, I don't know if you've got any good examples around this where you've seen things either that bring a smile to your face or thinking, oh my God, you shouldn't do it in that way.
It's a really interesting one, that positive return on investment, and it's often can be very woolly. So you invest £200,000 in the CRM, what's the ROI going to be on that? And as Alan said, actually it can get quite tricky to say, we anticipate an extra 100 members and working it all out. One rubric that I use, one very simple technique, is to assume over the 5 years that there's a 5% uplift in revenue, more events, more members, whatever it happens to be, only once. And for most organizations, that will cover the capital costs. And that's an extremely conservative assumption that you only get a 5% increase in revenue over 5 years. So turning benefits of high project costs and giving a single, clear, positive, very conservative number is often a really great way to get things actioned. But just, going back to the key point on this slide, for me, the projects that I see moving are often where there is a considerable risk in not doing this. Either that the strategy will not be delivered, that there are potential legal risks to the organization, i.e. their systems are going to be on unsupported platforms or technology, and being very clear about how not doing something is a decision and it comes at a cost, and articulating that cost is important. But again, people always love a good ROI, and the 5% thing that I use with a lot of boards often goes down very well because it's extremely conservative, and usually after 5 years you've covered your costs.
No, thanks, Charles. That's great, and I think to move that on to the final point that we wanted to cover today. Thus far we've talked about this great vision, everyone's buying into it, but it really is helpful if your execs making the decision also know how you get from here to wherever it is that you've sold them the vision to do. So those are things like, what are the stages in the project? Who's going to be involved in the project, and how much resources and time will they need at what stages in the project? What's the cash flow like, and so on. But it's also about making them understand the color of it. So if there's an upfront definition or discovery phase, how flexible can that be? But how well controlled will that also be, so it doesn't shoot off into random directions and so on. So it's very helpful in your document to put this is what we think we'll be doing month 1, month 2, quarter 3, quarter 4, quarter 5, and so on, so that people have got a good example of expectation and know what to prepare for in terms of the resources and the headcount that's going to be required for that. So again, back to Charles. What sort of level of detail do you think you need to go to this, and also, how careful should you be making about the how careful should you be about the promises you're making? Because essentially you're sticking your neck out a bit. So what can you reliably try to push forwards here, and what's required?
I think this is a really good point about the how, particularly the clarity on almost the steps. So what is the next practical steps? What do we have to do? So if there is approval for spend, how are we going to go about finding suppliers? How are we going to manage the project into the long term? Boards, in my experience, also incredibly interested about the resource impact. And again, there are simple ways that you can think about this. You can say, start dividing your staff into different groups. Those who will be very actively involved with the project. You might say it'll have an impact of half a day a week, or you'll need a project manager and this will be 2 days a week, whatever it happens to be for the scale of your project. But the clarity with which that is expressed helps the board be reassured that you've thought it through, that you're not just going to spend £300,000 on the supplier without thinking about actually there's £100,000 implication for our organization in terms of staff time or whatever it happens to be, and making sure that's clear. Also, that timeline, that roadmap, boards like to know, when is something going to happen? I've given you this cash, you've gone ahead, that's great. When will I start seeing the benefit? And it doesn't have to be particularly detailed. I don't find that boards want massively detailed Gantt chart. Usually 3 or 4 different stages over a timeline of a year or 18 months is enough. But again, they want to know, when will things start changing? And then also in that how, Steve made a really interesting point about responsibility. They want to know, if we make this decision, who am I turning to make sure it's being delivered? It'll be the response. Who's the senior sponsor within the organization? Who's the project manager? So they know who should be accountable.
Very good. So we've covered quite a lot of different ground here, and I hope that's helpful. And the next week, we've got a couple of minutes left. If there are some questions that I know we've already had some questions in, or any burning questions that have come in over chat. But Alan, would you like to sort of ask a couple of those for the next?
We've had some really good questions. We won't get to all of them in the time, but one is a kind of cry of pain from someone here saying, our trustees have been sitting on the funding request for over a year. Any advice, please? So I got some thoughts on that. Charles, do you mind? How can they make it a bit more urgent for people?
I'd want to understand why they're sitting on it. And there's a number of different reasons. It could be there are competitive pressures on spend. It could be they simply don't understand what they're being asked, or it could be they do not understand the implications of not doing something for a year. And that means engaging with them. Understand why are they delaying is the most important element there.
Great. And then just in the interest of speed, I'm going to go to a question of our management team say the cost is just too high, but it's the real cost of making the change. So Steve, can I just put this one to you? What happens if they're just saying, look, what you're asking for is just too much. We're not going to say yes.
Well, I think there's two quick answers. One is they could go to certain expert independent consultants who might tell them what a realistic budget actually is. If you guys know any. And the other side of it is, and we saw this in one of our own customers, they basically had set a rough expectation for budget cost, but they'd undercooked it quite a bit. But what they then did is look at where the benefits were and then start to measure what people were doing and what the cost of them wasting their time was. And the interesting thing about that was that it actually rejigged the whole project from what was going to be a website and portal replacement. And it made them realize that most of their benefits fast were in upgrading their accounting system and linking it to their CRM membership database. And that saved them something like 60K a year just by doing that. And so that started the whole project going fast.
Right. I think that's all the time we've got because we're already, I think we're already over. So I guess, Steve, it's just a case of wrapping up.
Okay. So, well, thanks very much. We covered quite a lot of ground there and it was a lot more conversational today. So we hope that's interesting for you and those of you that know our normal structure. Please give us feedback on that if you feel strongly one way or the other. As you'll know, we run these every month or two. The next one is in late summer. So that's about taking to the next stage. You've got your budgets from your board. Now, how do you run a successful selection? So we hope that you're interested in that one. And please register for that. It's at our website down the bottom in the normal way. And thanks very much. We hope you've enjoyed this. We'll be sending out emails to follow up with the links to the recording to those that could attend and couldn't attend. And also we'd like to engage with any of you that are interested in talking to us further about any of the points that we raised. So thank you very much and we hope to see you again soon.
Right. Thanks, everybody.